The ordinary day that wasn't ordinary. The Thursday heat was merciless, pouring down on the city of Tulsa like a heavy blanket no one could kick off. Asphalt shimmered, car tires hissed against the baking pavement, and even the breeze carried no comfort, only dust and the faint scent of exhaust. Lou's Diner, a weathered building with a chipped red sign that had hung above the door for decades, was packed tighter than usual. The regulars were there, truckers fresh off long hauls, office clerks stealing lunch hours, families trying to escape their hot kitchens. The air smelled of frying bacon, brewed coffee, and sizzling oil, a smell that clung to clothes and hair long after anyone left. It was a place where laughter mixed with impatience, where orders were shouted over the clatter of plates, and where comfort was served not just on plates but in routine. But on this day, that routine was about to shatter. Jessica Whitmore had worked here for 3 years, and she thought she had seen it all. Toddlers spilling chocolate milk on her shoes, truck drivers leaving messes big enough for 3 people, and couples who argued so loudly she wanted to disappear into the kitchen. But this Thursday was testing her patience in ways she hadn't felt in a long while. With her blonde hair tied up in a messy bun, sneakers worn down to threads, and apron stained from the morning rush, Jessica was running from booth to booth like someone on borrowed time. She had been on her feet since sunrise, and her legs throbbed as if the floor itself had decided to fight her. To make matters worse, a co-worker had called in sick, leaving Jessica to handle nearly half the floor alone. Plates piled up under the heat lamp, customers tapped their fingers against tables waiting for checks, and the manager kept shooting her looks that said, "Hurry or else." Jessica wasn't cruel by nature, but exhaustion had a way of making even the kindest people sharp. Every clinking glass, every shouted order, every request for just one more refill was another tug at her thinning patience. The constant motion of the diner was something she was used to, but today it pressed down on her like a weight she could no longer carry. Her smile had turned mechanical. Her thank yous sounded hollow, and every step felt like it took more from her than it gave back. And that was before the front door opened, and the woman who would change everything stepped inside. Danielle Hayes moved with the quiet grace of someone who carried both weariness and strength in equal measure. She was in her late 20s, her warm brown skin glowing against the soft blue of her dress. Her curls framed her face gently, and her hand rested protectively on her pregnant belly as she looked around the crowded diner. There was no arrogance in her, no air of entitlement. If anything, she carried herself with the serenity of someone who had already walked through storms and learned how to move within them. Yet the moment she entered, the noise of the diner shifted ever so slightly. It was not silence, but a soft dip, as if people instinctively gave her space without realizing why. She was not flashy, not covered in jewels or designer brands, but she radiated presence, the kind that made you take notice. Jessica, carrying a pot of coffee in one hand and balancing plates in the other, noticed her immediately and groaned inwardly. The last thing she wanted was another special request customer, the type who wanted substitutions for half the menu and would send food back 3 times before being satisfied. She muttered under her breath, too quiet for anyone to hear. Just what I needed. Another high-maintenance order. In her tired mind, she had already written the story. A well-dressed woman walking in alone at peak hours, asking for things the diner kitchen wasn't equipped to provide. Danielle walked slowly to a booth by the window and eased herself down, one hand still resting on her stomach as she adjusted into the seat. Her eyes wandered for a moment, watching the busy room with a quiet, almost thoughtful gaze. Jessica tugged at her apron, forced a customer service smile that barely touched her lips, and made her way to the booth with her notepad ready. "Afternoon," Jessica said, her tone clipped but polite enough to pass. "What can I get started for you?" Danielle looked up, her voice calm, carrying none of the entitlement Jessica had braced for. "Hello. Before I order, could I ask something? I'm pregnant and I have a few dietary restrictions. Would the kitchen be able to prepare my meal a certain way?" Jessica rolled her eyes inside her head. There it was, the request she had already expected. She tapped her pen against the notepad and forced out a laugh that sounded more like a sigh. "Well, I can't promise they'll roll out the red carpet, but I'll write down what you want." The sarcasm slipped out sharper than she meant, but Danielle only raised her eyebrows slightly. She did not snap back, did not scold. Instead, she offered a small, understanding smile, as though she saw past the irritation and chose not to take offense. "I understand. I'll keep it simple, she replied softly. Jessica scribbled quickly, already annoyed before a single word of the order left Danielle's lips. The rest of the diner pressed around her, the clinking forks, the laughter from the construction crew in the back, the hiss of the fryer, the impatient coughs of customers waiting too long. Everything felt like sandpaper against her nerves. She thought she was holding it together, but the truth was her patience was already split wide open. Danielle lifted her hand gently to get Jessica's attention again, and Jessica's shoulders stiffened. She turned back to the booth, pen tapping against the pad like a drumbeat of annoyance. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her smile gone. "I just wanted to double-check before you put the order in," Danielle said kindly. "Could the eggs be scrambled dry, no butter, and the toast plain? I can't have dairy right now, and if they have spinach instead of hash browns, I'd really appreciate that." The pen tapped harder, tap, tap, tap. Jessica wrote it down, her annoyance plain as day. Scrambled dry, no butter, plain toast, spinach instead. "Got it." She turned quickly, but Danielle spoke again, her tone still calm, almost gentle. "I know it's a lot. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Jessica's jaw tightened and the words slipped out before she could stop them. "You think you're the only one with special needs today? Half the diner's asking for something. I'll do what I can." The words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and impossible to take back. For a moment, Danielle simply looked at her, eyes soft but steady as though weighing something. Then she tilted her head, her voice carrying neither anger nor sarcasm, only truth. "I wasn't trying to make your day harder." Jessica spun on her heel, refusing to meet those eyes again, and shoved the order ticket into the kitchen window. Behind her, a regular named Mr. Randall, a retired mailman who had watched Jessica grow into the job over the years, muttered under his breath. She asked polite, "Jess, don't see the harm." Jessica snapped back, "You want an apron, Randall? Maybe you can handle it instead." Her words were sharp, defensive, but Randall only raised his eyebrows and turned back to his coffee. Silence weighed heavier than scolding ever could. Danielle adjusted herself in the booth, her hand smoothing the fabric of her dress, her other hand resting on her belly. She took a slow breath, scrolling on her phone while waiting, not showing anger, not demanding apologies. She wasn't here to start fights. She wasn't here to cause a scene. She only wanted a meal that wouldn't harm her or her child, but her calmness did not erase the sting of Jessica's tone, nor the way people nearby had noticed the exchange. The diner, in its own way, had started to pay attention. Jessica came back minutes later with a glass of ice water, her grip tight around the sweating cup. She set it down harder than she meant, the ice cubes clinking loud against the glass. "Here you go," she said flatly. Danielle smiled faintly. "Thank you." Jessica lingered a moment too long, staring, almost daring Danielle to ask for something else. Danielle gave a small, cautious smile and said softly, "I can see you've got a lot on your plate." "I didn't mean to add to it." Jessica half laughed, half snorted, and muttered, "Trust me, it's already overflowing." And with that, the smallest of sparks had touched dry wood. Neither woman knew it yet, but this tiny exchange, the clipped tones, the forced smiles, the quiet dignity met with sarcasm, was the beginning of something much bigger than both of them. Something that would, within days, spill far beyond the walls of Lou's diner and drag the whole city of Tulsa into its story. The spark that ignited the fire, the clatter of plates and hum of conversation filled Lou's diner, but somehow around Danielle's booth the air felt heavier. It was as though a quiet storm had entered with her, unseen yet sensed, waiting for a careless gust to push it into motion. Jessica busied herself behind the counter, stacking mugs, straightening silverware, and wiping at a spot on the counter that didn't need cleaning. Her motions were hurried, but her mind was elsewhere. She replayed the exchange with Danielle over and over, each time with a deeper sense of irritation. Why couldn't people just order off the menu? Why couldn't they just accept what they got instead of asking for special favors? To Jessica, it felt personal, even though it wasn't. She felt invisible most days, nothing more than an order taker, and yet somehow, people like Danielle made her feel smaller just by asking for things she couldn't give easily. But the truth was, the irritation Jessica carried wasn't really about Danielle at all. It was years of tiredness stacked on top of one another. Bills that never seemed to shrink, a car that rattled every time she turned the key, a boss who only noticed mistakes but never the work she did right. It was the boyfriend who had walked out last spring, leaving nothing but a pile of broken promises and rent she could barely cover on her own. It was the dream of finishing school that slipped further away with every double shift she worked. Danielle had just become the unlucky vessel for all of that frustration. Danielle, meanwhile, sat quietly, her hands folded gently on the table, her phone set aside. She could feel the tension radiating from the waitress, but she chose not to respond with anger. She had learned long ago that anger often fueled itself. It spread, it escalated, it consumed. Calmness, on the other hand, unsettled people more than shouting ever could. Her mind drifted to her unborn child, the quiet life moving within her, and she resolved to keep her composure for the sake of that life, no matter how harshly she was treated. Still, there was a sting in her chest, not because of the words, but because she knew how easily people judged without knowing a thing about her. The kitchen bell dinged, pulling Jessica from her thoughts. She grabbed the plate meant for Danielle and frowned. Scrambled eggs, toast without butter, and a small helping of sautéed spinach on the side. It wasn't hard. It hadn't taken the cook more than an extra minute to prepare. Yet somehow, seeing it made Jessica more irritated, as though the simplicity of the request mocked the storm she had created inside herself. She set the plate on a tray, added a glass of orange juice, and marched toward the booth with her jaw set tight. She placed the plate in front of Danielle with a bit more force than necessary, the fork clattering against the edge of the plate. "There you go," she said, her tone clipped. "Scrambled dry, no butter, spinach instead of hash browns. Just like you asked." Danielle looked at the food, then back at Jessica. She gave a warm, appreciative smile. "Thank you. I really do appreciate you taking the time. This will be perfect." Her gratitude was sincere, but instead of softening Jessica, it seemed to harden her further. The contrast between Danielle's calm tone and her own jagged one made Jessica feel defensive, like she was being silently judged. Without another word, she spun around and walked off, leaving Danielle alone at the booth. But diners are not private places. Every word spoken between Jessica and Danielle had been heard by at least a handful of people, and whispers were already spreading. Mr. Randall, the retired mailman, shook his head and muttered to the couple sitting near him. "Girl don't know who she's talking to. You don't treat people like that, especially not her." "Why? Who is she?" the woman asked. Randall didn't answer. He sipped his coffee and kept his thoughts to himself. But his silence carried weight, and that silence spread. People who didn't know Danielle began to wonder. People who did know her, though they were few, watched carefully, waiting to see what would happen next. Meanwhile, Danielle ate slowly, each bite deliberate. She did not let the sting of the waitress's tone sour her appetite. She had learned long ago that respect was not something always freely given, but it was always something you could carry within yourself. Yet, even as she kept her composure, she knew this moment would not end here. Not because she would make it into something larger, but because life had a way of revealing truths, often at the most unexpected times. Jessica, across the diner, poured more coffee, cleared plates, and pretended not to notice the looks drifting her way. Her co-workers exchanged glances too, some sympathetic, some disapproving. She ignored them all, focusing instead on the steady tick of the clock on the wall. 1 more hour, she told herself. Just 1 more hour of surviving this chaos, and then she could go home and leave this day behind. But deep inside, something told her it wouldn't be that easy. The shift wore on, and the tension lingered like a low hum beneath the noise. Then it happened, the careless act that tipped the spark into flame. Jessica, rushing past Danielle's booth with another tray of drinks, misjudged her step. The diner was crowded, the floor slick in one spot where a child had spilled soda earlier, and her sneakers squeaked loudly as she tried to steady herself. The tray tilted, the glasses rattled, and before she could stop it, 1 glass of ice water tipped forward. The cold contents splashed across the table, spilling onto Danielle's dress and soaking into the fabric, leaving dark patches spreading across the soft blue. Gasps rippled through the diner. A family in the corner froze, forks halfway to their mouths. The construction crew stopped laughing. Even the clatter of the kitchen seemed to pause for a moment. Jessica froze, her eyes wide, her mouth opening and closing like she had been struck dumb. The accident might have been forgivable. Spills happened, especially in a crowded diner, but what came next would define everything. Instead of apologizing immediately, instead of grabbing a towel and rushing to help, Jessica let her irritation speak first. Well, maybe if you didn't sit so close to the aisle, this wouldn't have happened. The words sliced through the silence like a knife. No one moved. No one spoke. The diner's chaos had melted into stillness, all eyes fixed on the soaked woman in the booth and the waitress who had just spoken with such sharpness. Danielle didn't react right away. She reached for a napkin slowly, dabbed at her dress with steady hands, and looked up at Jessica with eyes that carried no anger but something far heavier: disappointment. Her voice, calm but firm, broke the silence. Accidents happen, but blaming others for them doesn't make them easier. Jessica flushed, heat rising to her cheeks, but she said nothing. She turned sharply, muttering under her breath as she walked away. Yet her muttering didn't cover the whispers that were already circling through the diner like wildfire. That's her? That's Danielle Hayes, you mean? Yeah, his wife. Jessica didn't hear the words then, but she would soon. For now, she busied herself with another table, trying to act as though nothing had happened. Even as the weight of dozens of eyes followed her every move, Danielle sat in the booth, still calm, still composed, but beneath the surface. The quiet storm was gathering strength, and somewhere outside, beyond the diner walls, beyond the clink of dishes and hum of air conditioners, there were people who would hear about this before the day was done, people who would not take kindly to the idea that Danielle Hayes, pregnant and carrying the weight of more than just herself, had been humiliated in public. Inside the diner, the spark had been struck. Outside the diner, the fire had yet to see its fuel. But it was coming. The weight of consequences. The diner settled back into motion after the spill, but not in the same way as before. The sound of forks scraping against plates and conversations resuming was there, but it carried a different energy now, as if every person inside had been tuned into the same silent frequency. Lou's Diner had seen its fair share of small-town drama over the years. Arguments between lovers, customers walking out on bills, even the occasional scuffle when tempers boiled too hot. But this was different. It wasn't what happened that held people's attention. Spilled water, after all, was nothing unusual. It was the way the waitress had responded, the tone she had taken with a woman who had not raised her voice, not demanded anything, not once lost her composure. That tone lingered in the minds of everyone who had seen it, and slowly, very slowly, the story began to spread beyond the walls of the diner. Danielle had finished her meal in silence, taking small bites while her dress clung damp against her skin. She did not fuss, did not summon the manager, did not make demands. Instead, she dabbed at the water as best as she could, and carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had entered with. When she rose from the booth, slipping her phone into her handbag, every pair of eyes followed her. The sound of her shoes against the tile was soft, but it echoed in the ears of those watching. She moved with the calm certainty of someone who did not need to shout to be heard, who did not need to demand respect to receive it. She left a few bills neatly stacked under her plate and walked out the door without another word, the faint jingle of the diner's entrance bell marking her departure. Jessica noticed the silence that followed and glanced around uneasily. Conversation started again. But this time they weren't about the weather or sports scores. They were about her. She caught fragments, murmurs about how she had spoken, about the water, about that woman. And then she heard a name that made her stomach tighten. Hayes, one of the construction workers, muttered to another. That's Danielle Hayes, you know who she's married to, right? The other man lowered his voice, but not enough. Everyone knows who she's married to. Jessica frowned, confusion knitting her brow. She wanted to ask to interrupt, but pride kept her still. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her curiosity. Yet the name repeated in her head, Hayes. It was familiar, though she couldn't place it. She finished clearing the table she was at and hurried back behind the counter, her nerves starting to crawl beneath her skin. Mr. Randall, still seated with his coffee, caught her eye when she passed. He leaned slightly closer, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. You might want to pray, Jess. That wasn't just any customer you mouthed off to. Jessica bristled, trying to shake off the unease with sarcasm. What, is she royalty or something? Randall's eyes didn't waver. Something like that. Jessica's heart gave a small, uncomfortable thump. She wanted to laugh it off, but something in his expression told her not to. She carried on with her shift, but the weight of that silence, that name, and those stares clung to her like a second skin. By the time her shift ended, she was too tired to think straight. She tossed her apron into the back room, slipped out into the evening heat, and told herself it was nothing. Just a bad day, just a bad customer, just another shift she'd soon forget. But as she walked to her car parked 2 blocks away, her mind kept circling the same thought. Why did everyone look at me like that? That night, Jessica sat at her small kitchen table, a takeout box of leftover Chinese food open in front of her. She scrolled through her phone absently, looking at social media, trying to drown the unease with meaningless posts and funny videos. But her feed betrayed her. It wasn't long before a local news page caught her eye. The headline was ordinary enough, something about a charity event being hosted by one of the city's most prominent families. The photo attached showed a tall, broad-shouldered man in an immaculate suit standing beside a woman, with soft curls and a warm smile, her hand resting gently on her pregnant belly. Jessica's fork clattered against the takeout box as the recognition sank in. It was her. The woman from the diner, Danielle Hayes. Jessica leaned closer, reading the text beneath the photo. It named the man beside her, Marcus Hayes, a powerful businessman whose name carried weight across Tulsa. Some called him a philanthropist for his contributions to hospitals, schools, and community centers. Others whispered that his empire had roots deeper and darker than anyone dared to discuss openly. Whatever the truth, one fact was clear. Marcus Hayes was a man no one wanted to cross, and Danielle was his wife. Jessica's stomach churned. She replayed the scene at the diner in her head, her voice sharp, her sarcasm biting, the water splashing across Danielle's dress. She imagined Marcus Hayes hearing the story, imagined the look on his face, imagined what kind of man would let such treatment of his wife go unanswered. She pushed the takeout box away, appetite gone, her hands trembling slightly. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every sound in her apartment seemed louder. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of pipes, the distant bark of a dog outside. Each one made her jolt as though she was already being watched, already being judged. She told herself she was overreacting, that nothing would happen, that people like the Hayeses lived in their own world far above hers and wouldn't spare a second thought for a tired, underpaid waitress. But beneath that reasoning, a deeper fear took root. She had seen the way people in the diner looked at Danielle, the way they lowered their voices when her name was spoken. This wasn't something that would just disappear. The next morning, Jessica walked into Lou's diner with a pit in her stomach. She expected the usual bustle of customers, the clatter of breakfast orders, the familiar chaos, and it was there, but so were the whispers. Regulars who had been there the day before looked at her differently now. Conversations paused when she walked by, and eyes followed her with a weight she couldn't shake. Even her manager, usually more concerned with keeping the kitchen running than with gossip, gave her a look that carried more than annoyance. It carried warning. Jessica tried to push through, plastering on her smile, moving from table to table, pouring coffee, taking orders. But the unease grew with every step, every glance, every whispered word. By mid-morning, she was ready to collapse under the weight of it. She ducked into the back, leaning against the wall, her breathing uneven. She thought of Danielle again, her calmness, her soft but firm words, her quiet disappointment. It wasn't anger that haunted Jessica. It was that look that said she had expected better, that look that carried no need for shouting because truth spoke louder than rage. Jessica didn't know it yet, but beyond the walls of Lou's diner, her name was already beginning to spread in circles she had never imagined she would brush against. Danielle hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded retribution, but people had seen, and people talked. The city of Tulsa was listening, and Jessica was about to learn that one careless choice, one sharp tone, one moment of spilled water could ripple outward until it touched the lives of people she had never dreamed of. When worlds collide. For the next 2 days, Jessica tried to carry on as if life had not shifted under her feet. She clocked in at Lou's diner, tied on her apron, and forced herself through the rhythm of serving coffee, balancing plates, and smiling at strangers. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. Conversations dimmed when she entered a room, and coworkers who once laughed with her now spoke carefully, as if afraid to be caught on the wrong side of her story. Even customers she had never seen before seemed to study her longer than usual, whispers curling around their lips as though they had already heard something she wished they had not. The city felt smaller, as though every corner carried eyes watching her, measuring her, weighing her against an invisible scale she could never balance. At night, Jessica barely slept. When she closed her eyes, she saw the water spilling across the blue fabric of Danielle's dress, heard the gasps from the diner, and felt again the sting of her own sarcasm as it left her lips. What had seemed like nothing in the moment now loomed over her like a shadow she could not escape. Her chest tightened whenever she imagined Marcus Hayes hearing about it, imagined him sitting in one of his gleaming offices downtown while someone whispered in his ear, "Your wife was disrespected." That thought alone made her skin prickle with dread. On the third evening, her fear stepped out of her imagination and into her reality. Jessica had just finished her shift, the sky painted with fading streaks of orange and purple as she walked to her car. The street was quiet, lined with shuttered shops and the glow of flickering streetlights. She unlocked the driver's side door and had just slid inside when a shadow moved across her windshield. Her breath caught as she realized a man was standing there, tall and broad, his face hidden beneath the brim of a dark cap. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He simply slipped an envelope onto the hood of her car and walked away without looking back. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope, the paper cool and heavy in her fingers. She opened it under the dim glow of the streetlight and pulled out a single card. The lettering was embossed, simple yet elegant. Hayes Foundation, Downtown Offices. Beneath the printed name was a handwritten note in neat script. Tomorrow, noon. Jessica's stomach twisted. There was no explanation, no signature, no phone number, but she knew. She knew exactly who had sent it. She sat in her car for nearly an hour, staring at the card, debating whether to show up or run far away. But where would she go? And more importantly, what would happen if she didn't? The next day, dressed in the plainest outfit she owned, a simple blouse and slacks that had seen better years, Jessica stood in front of the towering glass building that housed the Hayes Foundation. It wasn't intimidating in the way she had expected. It wasn't lined with guards or draped in luxury. Instead, it looked modern, clean, and purposeful. The lobby was filled with art and photographs of community projects, schools being built, hospitals renovated, scholarships awarded to local students. It was the public face of Marcus Hayes, the side people praised in newspapers and honored with awards. Yet Jessica couldn't shake the whispers of the other side. The side people never dared to say too loudly. The power he held in boardrooms and backrooms, in places where money and influence ruled more effectively than laws ever could. A receptionist greeted her politely, as though she had been expected. Without asking her name, the woman gestured toward a set of double doors and said, "They'll see you now." Jessica's heart pounded as she walked through the doors into a private office. The room was spacious but not ostentatious. Shelves lined with books and awards filled the walls, and sunlight streamed through tall windows that overlooked the city below. At the center of the room sat Marcus Hayes, his presence commanding even in silence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his suit immaculate but not flashy, his eyes steady and unreadable. Beside him sat Danielle, her posture graceful, her hands folded lightly on her lap. She looked exactly as she had in the diner, calm, composed, quietly powerful. But now there was no mistaking who she was. Jessica froze just inside the doorway, her throat dry, her palms damp. She wanted to apologize immediately, to spill every regret she had carried since that day, but her voice caught in her chest. The silence stretched heavy and deliberate until Marcus finally spoke. "Jessica Whitmore," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of authority. "You've been the subject of a great many conversations these past few days." Jessica swallowed hard, her knees weak. I didn't mean—" Marcus raised a hand, silencing her with a simple gesture. "You didn't mean to spill water. You didn't mean to speak sharply. You didn't mean to let your exhaustion and frustration become disrespect." His words were not shouted, not cruel, but they cut sharper than anger ever could. Intent does not erase impact. Danielle's gaze softened as she looked at Jessica, her voice calm but firm. "I didn't ask for this meeting to punish you. I asked for it because you need to understand something. The way you treat people, even in your hardest moments, reveals who you are. You didn't know who I was that day. You didn't know whose wife you were speaking to. But that's the point. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to offer them dignity." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. She clasped her hands together to keep them from trembling, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I'm so sorry. I was tired, I was overwhelmed, but I know that doesn't excuse it. I should have treated you better. I should have treated everyone better." For the first time, Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you understand what saved you, Jessica? Do you understand why you're standing here in this office, speaking to us, rather than suffering consequences far worse?" Jessica's breath hitched. Because Danielle didn't tell you to destroy me?" Marcus's expression shifted into something unreadable, almost a faint smirk. "Because Danielle is merciful. And because she believes people can change. I am less patient. If it were up to me alone, this conversation might not be happening at all." Danielle reached out, her hand brushing her husband's arm gently before turning her full attention back to Jessica. "You're being given a chance, Jessica. A chance to take this mistake and let it change you. Not everyone gets that. Don't waste it." Jessica nodded quickly, tears slipping down her cheeks. She felt the full weight of their presence, the contrast between Marcus's sharp authority and Danielle's quiet strength. It was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. She realized that this was not about fear, not about power. It was about the choice she would make from this moment on. Marcus leaned back, his gaze steady. "Go back to your diner. Do your job. But remember this meeting every time you feel tired. Every time you feel invisible, every time you're tempted to lash out. You never know who is sitting in front of you. You never know the story they carry, the influence they hold, or the battles they're fighting. Treat them as if they matter because they do." Danielle gave a small, encouraging nod. "If you can do that, then this mistake may one day be the best lesson you ever learned." Jessica stood frozen for a long moment, then bowed her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance." The meeting ended as suddenly as it had begun. No threats, no demands, no punishment, only a lesson carved deep into her heart. As Jessica walked out of the Hayes Foundation offices, the sunlight seemed sharper, the air heavier. She felt both smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller in the presence of power she had never imagined. Larger in the sense that she had been given a chance to rise above who she had been. She knew this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something else. Something better, or at least it could be, if she chose it. The redemption, the morning sun spilled over the rooftops of Tulsa, washing the city in a golden glow. But for Jessica Whitmore, the day felt different. It was not the usual drag of exhaustion or the heavy dread she had grown accustomed to. Instead, there was something lighter in her chest, a strange clarity that had not been there before. Ever since that meeting at the Hayes Foundation, her world had shifted in ways she could not fully explain. She had walked into that building trembling with fear, certain she was about to be crushed under the weight of her mistake. But she had walked out with something she never expected: grace. Danielle Hayes had offered her something rarer than forgiveness. She had offered her a chance to change, and Jessica knew in her heart she could not waste it. Back at Lou's diner, things were not immediately easy. The whispers had not disappeared overnight, and the regulars still gave her curious glances, as though waiting to see whether she had truly learned anything. But Jessica did not shrink from it. She greeted each customer with warmth she forced herself to feel until, little by little, it stopped feeling forced. She listened when people spoke instead of brushing them off. She slowed down just enough to notice the details. A weary mother trying to calm her child, a truck driver who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, a student nervously clutching flashcards while eating eggs before an exam. She began to see people not as demands or burdens but as lives, each carrying their own weight, each deserving respect. Her co-workers noticed first. They saw her rushing less but accomplishing more. They heard the difference in her tone, softer now, patient even in chaos. The manager, who had long stopped expecting anything but complaints about her, began to hear praise instead. Customers left notes on receipts, not just tips but words. "Thank you for being kind. Thank you for listening. Thank you for making me feel welcome." Each note was a quiet echo of the lesson Danielle had pressed into her heart. Dignity costs nothing, but it changes everything. Weeks passed, and slowly the air around Jessica shifted. The nervous glances faded, replaced by nods of approval, even smiles from regulars who once muttered disapproval. For the first time in years, Jessica felt pride in her work. Not because she was perfect, Not because she never grew tired or frustrated, but because she chose again and again to meet others with respect instead of resentment. And in that choice, she found herself lighter, freer, less consumed by the bitterness that had once shadowed every step. Then, one quiet afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the diner windows, the bell above the door jingled, and a familiar figure entered. Jessica froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. Danielle Hayes stood there, her curls catching the light, her hand still resting gently on her growing belly. The room shifted again, just as it had weeks before, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't heavy with tension. It was filled with expectation. Everyone watched, wondering how this moment would unfold. Jessica did not hesitate. She set down the tray she was carrying, wiped her hands nervously on her apron, and hurried to the booth by the window where Danielle had chosen to sit again. This time her voice carried no edge, no forced smile. It carried only sincerity. "Welcome back," Jessica said softly. "It's good to see you." Danielle studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable, then gave a small warm smile. "It's good to be here." Jessica pulled out her notepad, but her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Whatever you'd like today, I'll make sure it's exactly right. No mistakes, no excuses." Danielle's smile widened and she reached across the table, gently touching Jessica's hand to steady it. "I believe you." Those two words sank deeper than any lecture could have. For Jessica, it was not just forgiveness, it was trust. And in that trust, she felt a piece of her old self fall away, replaced by someone stronger, someone wiser. As Danielle enjoyed her meal, Jessica moved through the diner with renewed purpose. She didn't just serve food, she served with intention, with dignity, with the awareness that every person mattered. And when Danielle rose to leave, leaving not just a generous tip but also a folded card on the table, Jessica's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a simple note written in the same neat script she remembered from that first summons. "I see your change. If you ever wish for more than this diner, come find me. We could use someone like you." Tears filled Jessica's eyes as she held the card close. It wasn't just an opportunity. It was proof that redemption was real, that one mistake didn't have to define her, that even the sharpest edges of her past could be softened by choosing a different path. From that day forward, Jessica was no longer the waitress who spilled water on a stranger, or the girl whispered about for her sarcasm. She became the woman who had been given a second chance and refused to waste it. Her story, once headed toward ruin, became one of redemption, whispered through the city not as a warning but as an inspiration. And as for Danielle, she never spoke publicly about the incident, never spread Jessica's name in anger. She didn't need to. Her silence had been enough to teach the lesson, and her mercy had been enough to change a life. The diner continued on as it always had, busy, noisy, filled with the smell of bacon and coffee. But for Jessica, nothing would ever be ordinary again. Because she had learned the most extraordinary truth of all. You never know who you're serving, and you never know how far a single choice for kindness can reach.